Dracula is the most famous vampire, but did he really exist? What is a vampire? How long have they been with us? And how relevant are they today? Join my vampire coven, where I will discuss a vampire chronology from the very first, an Italian called Ambrogio, right through the centuries to societies and clubs today where vampires live. I seek out the truth, distinguishing between folklore, media myths, and actual facts, focusing on those individuals that seeked out immortality by killing. I will also speak to vampiric experts, the leading contemporary experts around the world. But first, what is a vampire? The word vampire is an amalgam of the French vampire, the German vampire, and an Eastern European influence. According to legend, it is either a creature or a corpse. But one thing is certain, it is an entity that feeds off the life force of the living. Typically with fangs, vampires are said to be the undead, an undeparted soul, a demon that rises from its coffin, preying on family members and also village dwellers with an insatiable desire for blood. In the Middle Ages, they appeared as shrouds, almost bloated, ruddy, with a dark countenance. And it's only from the 17th century onwards where they appear as aristocrats with a pale skin. So, how do you become a vampire? Well, the obvious answer is you get bitten by one. But also, legend states that you can sometimes be practicing witchcraft. You can, if somebody commits suicide, a baby is born with teeth. And indeed, babies that are born between Christmas and the Epiphany also show traits of a vampire. So who was the first vampire? To reiterate, vampires are not born, they are made, usually by a vampire biting into another. So, if that's the case, how did the first come about? According to legend, about 1,000 years ago, an Italian adventurer by the name of Ambrogio travelled to Delphi in Greece, but angered the Greek gods, who placed various curses on him. Apollo, the god of sunlight, placed a curse that if Ambrogio's skin ever saw the sun, it would burn. Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, took away Ambrogio's soul. Artemis, the goddess of moon and hunting, and Apollo's sister, placed a curse that if Ambrogio's skin ever came into close proximity to silver, it would also burn. But she also took pity on him and gave him immortality, superhuman strength and speed. So what did Ambrogio do in Greece? Well, he didn't hunt humans. Instead, he preferred swans. Legend has it that after killing swans, he would take their blood and use it to write poems to his betrothed, the Lady Selene. So when Ambrogio got bored of Greece, he returned to his beloved Italy, residing in Florence, and there he created the first vampire clan. News reached many people who wanted the gift of immortality, and therefore his clan grew in numbers over the centuries, until infighting and various squabbles meant that other vampires withdrew and set up their own vampire clans. So what happened to Ambrogio? Well, many believe that he still exists and resides today. What is the link between disease and vampire folklore? Lack of understanding of infectious disease, how the body decomposes, and medical prognosis has exacerbated the rise in vampirism right up to the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Porphyria, rabies, tuberculosis, and pellagra were often linked. Porphyria, a blistering skin disease created by sunlight, which could only be alleviated by blood consumption, and the desire to bite, accompanied by frothing at the mouth, meant rabies was an obvious correlation. Pellagra, where the skin wanes, and the case of Mercy Brown from Rhode Island in the United States made tuberculosis an obvious example. Speaking of body decomposition now, whoever was suspected, if the cadaver had receding gums, a lot of hair, or full of fluids, then a charge of vampirism was often levied. So what are the vampire's strengths and weaknesses, and what are the most important strengths and the most dangerous weaknesses? Just talking about strengths first of all. A vampire has superhuman strength, which was illustrated in the TV series Twilight, where Edward Cullen stops Bella Swan being injured as a car approaches and is about to crash into her. He stops it with his hand. in terms of immortality, where the vampire could turn from being old, because they were invariably 250 or centuries old, to being a young man. This was illustrated in Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula in 1994, where Gary Oldman hosted Harker as an old man, and yet when he went to London to see Mina, he was young again. In terms of other strengths, it's that ability for vampires to regenerate and heal wounds quickly, always illustrated by Blade in the Blade films. In terms of, I suppose, other strengths, you're looking at the ability to shapeshift, to go from being human to a bat, and also a werewolf. Talking about weaknesses now, in the same way that Superman's Achilles heel was his planet Kryptonite, or his planet Krypton, and the Earth that was Kryptonite, a vampire's Achilles heel tends to be their aversion to sunlight, silver, and garlic. So just taking those three, as far as sunlight is concerned, well, we've all seen the case where a vampire, if they're exposed to sunlight, they turn to dust. As far as silver is concerned, when they used to stake a vampire through the heart, they would occasionally use wooden stakes, but it would be better if they used a metal, and silver was supposedly a better metal than iron. As far as garlic is concerned, if somebody had been bitten by a vampire, they would place garlic around their neck to stop that same vampire biting again. And also, for vampires that there was no hope for them, after decapitation, they would invariably place garlic in their mouth. Other weaknesses that probably are less significant. Vampires supposedly have to be invited in before they stake their prey. And also, supposedly the one way to escape from a vampire is if you had some seeds or some coins and you were to drop them in front of the vampire would be compelled to count. So that will give you some time to escape. Over the centuries, the literature written and the rise in the moving image has contributed significantly to both knowledge and superstition surrounding vampires. Early literature rendition focused on the vampire as just a creature with grotesque features such as pointed ears and hairy hands, possessing no real human condition, illustrated by the creature in the 1922 film Nosferatu. Then Stoker and others championed the vampire as being charming and very attractive, but at the same time having a beast that could be potentially unleashed. Then in the 1970s, things did change with authors such as Anne Rice, who looked at the internal characteristics more, citing that vampires could have feelings. And with the rise of the Gothic subculture in the 1980s, vampires were seen to be deadly, yes, but just like rock stars, super cool. In the 1990s onwards, vampires were romanticized. They were not seen as all evil. Some could be actually good, as shown in the TV series Vampire Diaries. Also, they could love one another, as shown by Buff and Angel, that special relationship they had in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And vampires, could they even form a relationship with a human? Bearing in mind that humans were their staple diet. This was illustrated by Stephanie Meyer in the Twilight series with the relationship between the vampire Edward Cullen and the human Bella Swan. So to conclude, over the years, we've gone from demonic creatures to some people with vampires with a heart, and they're not to be feared as much as before. Let's look into further examples now and the way in which vampire media has impinged on society. In 1748, Heinrich Ossenfelder wrote the first short poem called The Vampire, about an aging man searching for a young woman. Lord Byron followed up with his own poem called The Gayor, which in Turkish means infidel, and focused on the practice that the Turks used to do with adulterous women, and they would place them into sacks, sew the sacks up, and then throw them to their deaths in the sea. In 1819, John Polidori, who was incidentally the physician of Lord Byron, wrote the first short story called The Vampire, and it was the French spelling of vampire. And this focused on an aristocrat called Lord Ruthven and his stalking of young women. Interestingly enough, 25 years before Stoker wrote Dracula, an Irish author called Sheridan Le Fanu wrote the first novel about a female vampire called Carmilla. It's interesting that all the Dracula things we've seen over the years has had a man in the title role. In 1931, the Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi was the first to play Count Dracula on film, and is widely regarded as the best. Christopher Lee and Hammer Films would have something to say about that, bearing in mind they shot 6 films between 1958 and 1973. But because Lee, over the years, has been critical of Hammer and their scripts, which never really adhered to Stoker's vision, his portrayal has been not really garnered the same sort of critical acclaim. In the 1970s, the aforementioned Anne Rice wrote the Vampire Chronicles, which were numerous novels, and most of them have been turned into film, most notably in 1994, Interview with a Vampire, starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise in the title role of the French nobleman Lestat. Other notable mentions include True Blood, which was an American TV series that ran from 2008 to 2014, set in South America, and focused on vampires that instead of using human blood, they preferred synthetic blood. And I suppose Wesley Snipes, in his portrayal of the Blade superhero series, where he plays a vampire, half human, a daywalker. And I suppose they would be honourable mentions. So let's turn our attention now to Stoker's novel, 1897, Victorian England. Dracula is buying up property in London. After the mysterious disappearance of solicitor Mr. Renfield, that same firm charges a young lawyer by the name of Jonathan Harker to travel to Transylvania and to execute business with Dracula. Despite Dracula lunging at Harker when he cuts himself shaving, Harker is asked to stay for a month, explaining to both his employer and his family that he is fine. Harker soon realizes he is just a prisoner and probably going to be the Count's next victim. One evening, he leaves his bedroom chamber, much to the annoyance of his host, and is seduced by 3 female vampires who are actually Dracula's brides. Meanwhile, Dracula sails to England, accompanied by 50 coffins filled with his native soil. In England, Mina, who is Harker's fiancée, is helping out a socialite by the name of Lucy Westerner to field potential suitors before she chooses who to marry. One evening, because Lucy is known to sleepwalk, Mina follows and she sees Lucy in a graveyard, and shrouded in mist, this creature envelops Lucy. Mina is petrified, but the creature sees Lucy and disappears. Mina approaches Lucy and is horrified to see not 1, but 2 pinpricks on her neck. Mina then gets news that her betrothed, Jonathan Harker, is safe and well, and he asks Mina to accompany him in Romania to get married. Lucy falls sick, and despite a blood transfusion by Dr. Seward and the eminent Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, it is no good. Why? Because Dracula drains Lucy's blood again and condemns her to a life of a vampire. At the same time, both Lucy and Jonathan Harker return from Romania, and they talk to Van Helsing, and Van Helsing is most interested in Harker's adventure and whether he partaked in any of Dracula's blood. Van Helsing, Harker, Seward decide that they must pursue Dracula. But first, as time passes, and because children have disappeared in their village, they go to the tomb of Lucy. They stake her through the heart, cut off her head, and feed her mouth with garlic. They then track Dracula down, and they go through every one of those 50 coffins, but he is not there. He has vanished. They then find Mina sucking Dracula's chest for the blood it contains. They confront Dracula, but Dracula flies away. He turns into a bat, gets on the next ship back to Transylvania. Harker, Van Helsing, Seward, et al. Pursue Dracula. They're thinking that the train will be quicker and cut him off at Varna. But Dracula is too smart for them. He and his gypsies then travelled to Bran Castle. Abraham Van Helsing and Mina decide to go by carriage, whereas Seward, Harker, et al., they travel by fast horses, galloping away to Bran Castle. They get to the castle. They open up every coffin. They get to the coffin of Dracula. They open it up, and there is Dracula. He opens his eyes. They stake him through the heart. They cut off his head, and he vanishes, turns to dust. There's been lots of speculation as to whether Bram Stoker did indeed base his Dracula upon a real historical figure. So let's look into who that figure was, analyse Stoker's novel before drawing any conclusions. The real Dracula was Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Tepes III, voivode of Wallachia. Voivode means in Romanian warlord, and he ruled between 1456 and 1462. Born in 1428, he was the son of Vlad II Dracul. Dracul in Romanian means dragon. And Vlad II was a member of the prestigious Order of the Dracul, a military order dedicated to protecting European Christians from foreign invaders. Now, Vlad III took the A and added it to Dracul, forming Dracula as we know it, which means son of the dragon. Vlad II and his two sons were captured in 1442 by the Turks and imprisoned in Tokat Castle by the then Sultan Murad II. Whilst incarcerated, Vlad III schooled himself in Ottoman military tactics and traditions, which he used in later life to great effect. Firstly, against the Hungarian Saxons, and then against the Ottoman Empire itself. It took Mehmed II, who was the son of Murad II, and 150,000 Turks to eventually vanquish Vlad the Impaler. And in 1462, after seeing 20,000 of his men impaled, he lost the will to fight and retreated. However, Vlad III ran out of cash, so of course when Mehmed eventually returned, he was incarcerated for 12 years, and eventually released in 1476, where he started another skirmish with the Ottomans and unfortunately perished. So how did Vlad get the name Impaler? Well, that was his favourite way to torture and kill his victims. And the way he would impale a victim is he would get the victim to sit astride a pointed stick, and eventually when that victim's legs gave away, they would be impaled. Ooh. Now, allegedly, he would sit and dine in front of all these impaled victims. And indeed, he would dip his bread into their blood. And Son, who was a leader of the Hungarian Saxons, was allegedly hacked to pieces while Vlad just nonchalantly ate his dinner. So, did Bram Stoker base his Dracula on Vlad the Impaler? Stoker's research notes disappeared for 60 years, so that's probably why a lot of speculation and theories emerged. His widow sold his notes soon after his death, and they didn't reappear again until the 1970s. Stoker asserts that his Dracula descended from Attila the Hun, a Hungarian tribe, whereas Vlad the Impaler was from Sighisoara in Romania. Stoker, both in his novel and research notes, doesn't use the word Vlad. He prefers the term Count Vampire, and indeed his definition of Dracula, he believes the word came from devil, not dragon. He also started his count coming from Austria, only later making him come from Transylvania. There were various pamphlets, I believe 4, that were made available at the British Museum, but there's no evidence that Stoker consulted them. There's also this argument that Stoker based his Count Dracula upon the traits of Sir Henry Irving. Sir Henry Irving was an actor and he owned the Lyceum Theatre, of which Stoker was the business manager. In recent times, the pursuit of immortality has motivated several serial killers to drink their victims' blood. Notably, Fritz Harman, the vampire of Hanover, killed 24 people between 1918 and 1924. He was guillotined and his brain was preserved for science and is reviewed by criminologists even today. Then came the Vampire of Sacramento in 1978, a certain Richard Chase, who killed 6 people in a month. Guilty of necrophilia, when he was arrested, his apartment was raided and they found his eating utensils covered in blood. After that, there's the curious case of Andrei Chikatilo, also coined the Ripper of Rostov. He killed 53 between 1978 and 1993. His modus operandi was to remove people's eyes and sexual organs, preying on the young. Understandably, he was guillotined in 1994. Recently, Australian vampire killer Tracy Wiggington, she and 3 other lesbians lured a man into their car in 1989, stabbing him 27 times. She was put away for 22 years but has been recently released. And in 2001, we had the teenager Matthew Hardman, who brutally murdered a 90-year-old pensioner in North Wales. He spooned out her heart, and at his trial, his mother was mortified that he was so callous and showed a lack of remorse. But again, he had this desire to be immortal, and a previous girlfriend reported that he pleaded with her because he thought she was a vampire. So he pleaded with her to bite into his neck, thinking that would turn him. Stoker used a lot of Romanian superstition in his novel, borrowing from Emily Gerard's Romanian superstitions, and also he used the trait of shapeshifting where Dracula turns into a werewolf from Sabine Baring-Gould in the book of Werewolves. Looking at the Romanian superstition for a moment, if blue light appears, then arguably there is treasure underneath, and if you took that treasure, then a demon could potentially appear at your door wanting their cut. So the best way to make sure to show that demon that they're not welcome is if you place 3 pieces of coal outside your house. Talking about werewolves now, in Stoker's novel we see Dracula turning into a werewolf on 2 occasions where he drains the blood of Lucy Westerner, and also when he's entertaining Jonathan Harker, he bares the palm of his hands, showing Harker that he has that werewolf trait. Are vampires real, or are they just a figment of our imagination? Over time, the rise in literature and media, coupled with the lack of understanding of disease, has contributed to the myth. But there's no doubt serial killers use bloodthirst as a motivation to kill. However, are these criminals classified as mentally unstable just to contain their actions? Fortunately, modern policing ensures they cannot continue their destructive ways, and in general, mass killings are rare. But if more and more killers exhibit these vampiric traits, surely we cannot disregard them as deranged humans. Or could they be indeed vampiric?